All right, today we have on Dr. Allison Brager. She has quite the resume and she is considered an expert, especially in the area of sleep. She is a neurobiologist and studies sleep, circadian rhythm, and examines substrates and mechanisms of resiliency to extreme environmental stressors, that being exercise, jet lag, sleep deprivation. She is in the military, so has a lot of background in that realm there. She has several leadership and service positions for the federal government, professional research societies, and university departments. She is part of fatigue management or sits on the board for fatigue management and neuro enhancement working groups through NATO, U.S. Special Operations Command, Office of the Army Surgeon General, and Intergovernment. There's a bunch of letters here: DoD, NASA, FAA, NHTSA, and NIH. She has also written military training doctrines on holistic health and co-authored the first edition of the NCAA Student Athlete Mental Health Handbook. She serves on the board of directors and has chaired committees for the Sleep Research Society, Society for Research on Biological Rhythms, and Gordon Research Conferences. In addition to over 30 peer-reviewed publications and flagship society journals, she has written op-ed column pieces for science and professional society bulletins and has been on many podcasts. And she's also written a book entitled Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain. The book content ties the fields of exercise physiology and neuroscience with her own experiences as an elite athlete in track and field as well as CrossFit. She also is an advisory board member for Momentous Supplements, Whoop, NASM, Fit AIDS, and the last and most interesting part is she might actually be going to Mars.
That's right. Someday, 2024.
Yeah, so I think that's the coolest part is you have all this crazy education, and it's just not everyone says that they are in training to be an astronaut every day that comes on my podcast. So how did you come to that, first of all?
I've always wanted to be an astronaut. I know that's been the childhood dream of many people. I also grew up in Ohio, so I grew up idolizing John Glenn. I also grew up idolizing Sally Ride, and I'd always looked for that opportunity to apply someday. And a few years ago, I learned about the Army Astronaut Corps, and so basically, I put in the application. Some current astronauts who are also in the Army selected me. And so I spent about a week undergoing assessment and selection down at NASA. I unfortunately didn't make the final cut of 10. So the 10 selected for my class, they're the first class to start training for Mars. But my dream isn't dead yet because I have the opportunity to reapply in 2024.
Now, I'm really curious, like, what's that? So, if you do get selected in the next round, what's that training process look like?
Oh, it's years. I mean, it's truly years just learning how to survive and thrive in extreme environments. As you can imagine, most of the training is actually done in the pool because that most simulates and emulates what it's like in space. I do have a background in dive medicine. A few years ago, I went through the Army's dive medicine course in Key West in order to prepare and to make me more competitive for the astronaut process. They do a lot of group training exercises in very austere environments where they'll have these different. You can think of it like Survivor. That's the best way to think about it. Is that the challenges that they do on Survivor and those other shows, Real World, whatever. That's what they're doing.
And so, what would someone like you be doing on Mars? Like, what would your job be with your like research background and everything?
I don't really know, but here's the thing. When you're an astronaut, you're kind of working on a team collectively on these different science experiments. Um, a lot of the astronauts, they do think for themselves, but they're basically also directed by mission command what to do. Um, and I do know, like, they do small animal surgeries a lot, which is actually my background, because my background's in looking at new use cases for drugs and how different drugs affect different brain areas, which affect sleep. And so they basically will do these small animal surgeries, and mission command or whatever subject matter expert on the ground is telling the astronauts like what to do. So it's it's a delicate balance of thinking for yourself and being okay with being told what to do, you know.
Yeah, for sure. That's just it's wild that maybe I get to say, hey, I I had a podcast with this woman one day that is now landing on Mars. So it's
Yeah.
pretty,
Well, I mean, here's the thing though. My mom, she hates that I say this, and she actually first heard it on a podcast I was on. But I would do the one-way mission to Mars too. Like if they were looking for a group of astronauts who would like just go up and not come back, like I would sign up for it because I mean that's how badly I like want to be a part of the space program. Which again would sound crazy to most people, but you know, I think I live my life a little differently.
yeah, that's definitely a different way to live your life. And so, what we really want to talk about today with you, Allison, is sleep. So, there is a lot to sleep. There's many facets to it, and the biggest thing is, I think at this point, everyone kind of understands that sleep is important and that it has many benefits to it. But I don't think people fully understand its utility in making their whole life better. Like, if there's a few things that make people healthy or healthier, it's sleeping better, drinking water, walking, and exercising regularly, and not eating like crap. And sleep is one of those things. And I'm a I'm part of it too. Is like there's not enough hours in the day. We have other things to do. We tend to put it off and get less than we should. So I mean, just for starters here, like, can you just give a brief overview to give people a new understanding of the importance of sleep?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to there's no single universal function for sleep. So, sleep is important for muscle repair and recovery. It's important for recovery through anabolic hormones released, like growth hormone, testosterone. It's important for clearing toxic waste from our brain. It's important for learning and memory, emotional regulation, threat detection, gut health. Gastrointestinal health. Um, it's truly important for everything, and so much so that if you look at the two states of sleep, so you have non-rapid eye movement sleep or non-REM sleep, and then REM sleep. REM sleep is all about cognitive restoration, so that's what's important for learning and memory. And then non-REM sleep is really important for all the physical restorative aspects of sleep. And so it's really all encompassing.
And where does like because there's REM sleep, there's also deep sleep. Is that different than REM sleep?
Yeah. So deep. Okay. So this is where the separation between clinical terms and buzzwords in the media sort of um, get separated. So deep sleep, how most people see it, is the deepest stage of non-REM sleep. It's called stage 3 non-REM. And REM sleep combined. So that's how wearables usually report sleep. Is it's a combination of both. Um, clinically, REM sleep is REM sleep, but clinically non-REM sleep is stage 1, 2, and 3. And stage 3 sleep is really where you're seeing like these deep restorative processes happening, if that makes sense.
Hmm. And something I've always been curious of too, because I was wearing a wearable for a bit. And it was the Whoop, and I think people think like the more deep sleep you get, the better, but that's not actually the case, is it?
So it depends what kind of deep sleep. So if you're getting more stage 3 non-REM sleep, that is really good because that's where a lot of the anabolic restorative properties are occurring that I talked about prior. If you're getting too much REM sleep, that usually means you're making up for lost sleep deprivation or lost sleep due to sleep deprivation. So it's kind of this delicate balance, double-edged sword. Ideally, deep sleep should make up about 40 to 50% of your total sleep time. So REM sleep, a majority of people, about 15 to 20% of their total 8-hour sleep time should be REM sleep. If you have anything greater than 20%, that's clinically significant. If you have anything less than 10%, that's also clinically significant. Um, Whereas deep non-REM sleep, so stage 3 non-REM sleep, makes up about 30 to 40% of total sleep time if you're sleeping for 8 hours. So
Okay.
that's where those numbers come from.
All right.
If it didn't hurt.
We need a chalkboard for this podcast.
No, I know it's hard to, and that's why I think it's really important that the experts in the sleep field are sitting on these advisory boards advising these wearable companies because I mean, trust me, we've sort of given, the field has sort of given up on the internet charlatans. Like, there's so many people in the fitness and personal training industry who truly think they're sleep coaches. Like, I really hate that term that people say they're a certified sleep coach. Like, that is, in my opinion, that's complete bullshit. Um, because there's so much training and other nuances of being an expert that comes into being the expert beyond just reading studies on Google.
I didn't even know there was such thing as a sleep coach. So
Oh
thanks
yeah,
for.
don't even get me started. It is like the biggest point of contention amongst the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. It's Yeah, it's a touchy subject
I
because
can I can see that. So for the people and more people are wearing wearables, whether it be the Apple Watch, the Whoop, the Aura Ring, um, I don't know, a Fitbit, anything else out there. What should people take from those? And so uh, I have friends that work in different spaces of this realm too of wearables, and uh, some can be fairly accurate. Sometimes they're not super accurate. We shouldn't always take them as 100% accurate. So, what should people know when they're wearing these things? Like, what are the good things they can take out of them and use to improve their performance recovery? And what things should they kind of just be wary of and like not worry about so much? Maybe.
yeah, great point. I actually just got off a phone call with the chief medical officer of the Big Ten conference, and we were talking about this because one of the things that can happen with wearables is it can further create anxiety around sleep. Right? Um, I've seen this a lot with people who sometimes on Whoop, the Whoop platform, I'll be the subject matter expert for the day where anyone can ask me anything. And all of people who, have admitted that if they don't go to bed at that time every single night, or they become so obsessed with obtaining the sleep score they want on the Whoop, that then they end up sleeping really poorly that night and thereafter because they put it's performance anxiety. It really, that's what it is. Um, but the good thing about the wearables is it can give you a baseline and help you change your current lifestyle habits. I think some of the best stories that have come out, I know Whoop has done this, where they have been able to show that people who are using the Whoop actually drink less alcohol because so many people have this enlightenment that when they drink, their recovery the next day is crap. And so, over the course of a year, a majority of their users report drinking less because of recognizing that it affects their sleep. Same thing with nutrition, eating high fat, high sugar foods, especially close to bedtime, because that will definitely disrupt your sleep. Um, that's something else lifestyle wise people have changed. People have changed up how much they train. They've changed up hydrating, right? Being able to hydrate more often because that will affect your recovery score. So I think looking at these broad level trends are really what's most important about the wearables. And to quote a very well known mental performance coach in the field of professional sports, his name is Clive Brewer. He's worked with the Toronto Blue Jays during their height point of success. He's worked with Manchester United. He worked with the Columbus Crew when they won the Major League Soccer championship that year. Is he'll say data should make you curious, and that's really all it should do. Is you shouldn't be fully basing, in my opinion, your decisions to train that day or to engage in a behavior just because your recovery score says this. Now, a few days of trends, sure, you make a decision not to train. But on a single day incident, I, I don't necessarily agree that you should not train because of that.
Yeah, that's something I think some teams or organizations have banned some fitness wearables because it was just affecting player performance of like, well, I'm not, 92% recovered today, so I
Yeah,
shouldn't train that hard where it's like, well, being fully recovered means like you're not training hard enough. Like we shouldn't always be in the green and perfectly ready to perform in our max. Like part of training, like with powerlifting, especially in weightlifting, like what there is a certain point in time where my athlete will come to me like my strength has gone down. And it's like, no, it's there. It's just hidden in all the volume you're doing right now. And when we take that away and you super compensate, you'll see that on the platform when you PR.
exactly. I mean, to speak in physiological terms, allostasis, right? In order to reach the next level, to reach a new baseline, you have to put your body through stress. And not an insane amount of stress where it can't recover from, but just mild acute bouts of stress where it learns to adapt and from that it grows.
Yeah. And so that actually brings up a good question. So like I'm most familiar with the Whoop because I've used it in the past, but is there a certain line that says, hey, like today's not a training day versus, in this certain percentage range of recovery, like you're good to go? Or how would you look at something like that?
I would say, and so remember, my background's in sleep medicine, so you don't, most people don't know this. The Army invented this first sleep wearable back in the 80s and 90s. So the original clinical grade sleep wearable was through a collaboration with DARPA. And one of my mentors, he's now retired, Dr. Greg Belinky, literally took the Army's wearable and put it on soldiers during the Gulf War. And so the general rule of thumb with the clinical grade wearables is that 2 weeks worth of data, 2 weeks worth of nighttime sleep amounts matches a single night of getting a sleep study. So it takes that long for the device to calibrate. Now, obviously, the devices have advanced somewhat since the days of the 80s and 90s. But I say all this because I'm a big fan of trending and not, again, single incidences. So for me, I would say 3 to 5 days is the determination point when you decide not to train. So if you have 4 days of in the red performance and you've felt you've done everything right, like you haven't drank, you've tried to get good sleep, you've been hydrating, but you just can't get out of the red, whether because you're sick or just for whatever reason you're in a heightened sympathetic state and you're overtrained, then yes, then I wouldn't train, but I would never ever base it on a single night of being in the red.
Okay, cool. And I wanted to mention too, Allison did another podcast on the O2X podcast that basically went through the 10 best ways to maximize sleep. And it was very intelligently done too, in orders of like easiest and most cost effective to hardest and kind of least cost effective. So
Yep.
if you guys want to check that out, that would be a good idea. I won't make her go through all those same steps again. We'll probably talk through some of them as we go here, though.
Good.
So
I don't even remember what I wrote down, to be honest with you. I mean, I remember the basics, but I can't tell you what the 10 are in order. But I did put a lot of forethought into that for that reason. I went from easiest to hardest and most cost effective to least, cost effective.
yeah, so um, the so just a couple of those things. Like, what are some of the big things people are typically doing that are throwing their sleep off?
I would think I mean, everyone knows about cell phones, TVs, and electronics now. I think that's, sort of been 95% of Americans or people around the world know that that's you should not look at your cell phone at least an hour before bed. Um, but I do think people aren't dimming the lights in their house. So I strategically, so I obviously move a lot. I'm active duty military. And when I'm trying to select a new place to live, I try to find a place, and you can kind of sort of see this here, that has natural light and then also makes it easy to dim the lights at night. And so that's the biggest thing, is having a situation where you're have access to bright natural light during the day, and then access to dimming the lights at night. I think that's one thing people don't realize. Another thing is, okay, even if you have blue light blocking glasses, that doesn't mean that you should be on your phone and watching TV anyway, because part of the problem is it's not just the blue light, it's stimulating your brain, right? Your brain is trying to calm down and to literally slow down the brain activity so that it could fall asleep. And when you're on TikTok or watching Netflix up until your bedtime, you're it's counteractive.
Is there any like statistical measures or anything you have there, like how badly watching TV or using your phone before bed is, or like
Um,
what improvement you can get by eliminating that?
I mean, I would say the general rule, and how I'm basing this on is from looking knowing what we know about dim light melatonin onset. So say you are dimming the lights in your house and you're turning on Netflix with your blue light blocking glasses on, 40 minutes before bed. That's still bad, because within 10 minutes of you dimming the lights, your brain's going to start secreting melatonin. And even though like it doesn't have the blue lights to prevent it, your brain's still in a highly active state because you're watching whatever's on Netflix, unless you're watching like and if you ever watched the Great British Bake Off, like a show like that, most people aren't watching that before they go to sleep. So that I think that my wife watches that show, and it puts me to sleep, but maybe it excites her. Sorry.
Hmm. And what else do we have here? So again, sleep is so good for us. For me, when it's on point, everything else is much better. But do you think there's a reason people just like put sleep off? Is they don't see the benefit of it?
Yeah, because yeah. So our godfather of the field. He recently just passed away. His name was Dr. Bill Dement. He lived to the age of like 98, but he's the godfather of sleep medicine. He always used to say sleepiness makes you stupid, and that's pretty much true. Is we all have this invincibility complex that we'll be okay because most of us know what our points of resiliency are. Um, and with sleep, we tend to put it off until we can't any longer. But the problem is, when we can't any longer, something catastrophic is going to happen. We see this in the military all the time. Some of the major catastrophes that have happened in recent years, when soldiers, sailors, and airmen have died because of commanders and leaders being sleep deprived, is a direct result of this, where at a certain point in time, it comes on as quickly as it passes. They can't stay awake, and then they get into an accident. Or in the case of the Navy a few years ago, there's two guided missile carriers that crashed into each other. Like that, I don't know if you know, that literally happened. So it's it's a thing. It's sleep creeps up on us when we least expect it.
Yeah, and it just becomes a vicious downward spiral and cycle. It seems like.
Exactly.
And something else you talked about, I saw that was rather interesting, was the whole theory on sleep debt and it being like a bank account. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is sort of dispelling the myth of sleep banking. You can sleep bank, because we have tons of clinical evidence for it. I worked at the infamous Walter Reed, and we basically were the first to demonstrate sleep banking, meaning that if you take people who normally get good sleep and you let them sleep in prior to being sleep deprived, they actually do much, much better during that sleep deprivation in terms of their cognitive performance, their athletic performance, and their emotional state than people who didn't have that opportunity. And it makes sense a lot when you think about without getting too deep into the weeds, the neurochemical um, substrates and mechanisms how sleep works. There's this thing called sleep drive that's driven by adenosine. And so throughout the day when we're awake, adenosine levels in our brain accumulate. But it isn't until we get sleep at night that these adenosine levels then decline. Um, and so it's, from a neurochemical perspective, it makes sense with this credit or debit system too.
And so, with that being said, like, what about like waking up in the right sleep cycle or waking up in the wrong one? Is that something you guys still consider? Is it something like sometimes you feel like you do that, like if you nap too long, or there's definitely days I wake up and I'm ready to go, and other days I kind of drag on, and either way, I've had maybe 7 to 8 hours of sleep. So, what's that all about?
Yeah, so waking up out of REM sleep is the most important. So the reason for that is when we go through these sleep cycles, it goes from non-REM sleep to REM sleep to wake. And there's different neurochemicals secreted during non-REM sleep than there are during REM sleep. REM sleep actually looks a lot like wake. The only difference is during REM sleep, your muscles are paralyzed. So there's this signal from the brain that basically deactivates every single muscle group in your body except for the diaphragm, the muscles in your inner ears, and then your eyes. But every other muscle in our body during REM sleep is completely paralyzed. And so, because of that, if you wake up out of a state of REM sleep, you already have this, neurochemical pool that already is primed for wake, with again the difference being, now your muscles can work, but before they couldn't.
Okay. And so, that being said, if you wake up in the wrong cycle, you just kind of have this pool of chemicals that are there that are primed for sleep.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So a lot of non-REM sleep is heavy on GABA. So GABA is the major inhibitory neurochemical of the brain. Acetylcholine is very much favored during REM sleep, just like wake, and that's a wake promoting chemical.
and so if you wake up in that cycle that your body is still saying sleep, and you're full of GABA, uh, is that going to set you up for poor performance for the whole day? Even if you got 8 hours of sleep and you woke up in the wrong cycle per se, and you weren't super sleep deprived beforehand, is that going to impede performance at all for the day, whether it be cognitively, physically, or is this something that like after 30 minutes or so, like we might be good and flush those neurotransmitters out of our body?
Yeah, so it's within the first 30 minutes to an hour. So the clinical term for it is sleep inertia,
Okay.
which everyone experiences sleep inertia in the morning. That's that initial state of grogginess, whether we have caffeine or not. And with sleep inertia, so like obviously in the military, that's something we're trying to mask or exploit, where we're trying to minimize it completely. So we have all these proprietary things we're doing to trying to minimize that, because for our guys and gals, waking up in the middle of a deep stupor means you might be putting your boots on and going out the door. So, um, but yeah, there definitely is a performance decrement, but it's not sustaining. And if it is, it's that person actually is not as well rested as they thought, or it might be psychological.
Yeah. And so, because I know there's apps and things now too that will try to like wake you up in your right sleep cycle or out of your proper sleep cycle, but it almost sounds like it's not maybe not the best thing, and that just getting as much sleep as you can would actually be better.
Yeah, I'm all about doing it a la natural versus using apps and technology, because think about it, sleep is by the brain, for the brain, and of the brain. So tell me how that app knows exactly what state of sleep you're in. I mean, sure, wearables do to an extent, right? They're only about 80 to 85% accurate with an actual clinical sleep study. But even then, the transitions between non-REM and REM sleep are so abrupt and quick. I am very doubtful that there's an app that can capture that.
Mm. And then you said when we're talking before the show, you said part of your real specialty was in the genetics of sleep. So we were talking about these people that are like sleep hyper responders, and there's a genetic component to that. So I don't think I have that,
I
unfortunately,
don't
but
either. I joke with people. I will never be anyone important in the military someday because I like sleep too much. There's no way I will retire happily as a colonel. There's no way, even if I wanted to, make it to general level because I like sleep too much, and you can't. That lifestyle is not set up for getting 8 hours of sleep.
yeah. And so what is it about these sleep hyper responders? Like, how much sleep do they need versus like the normal human being?
So the gene is called DEC2, DEC2, um, and typically these individuals need 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night. Now, remember, this is like less than 1% of the population. So, um, and they've never really tested this, but I think where you see this or and where this gene is pre-selected in is if you look at some of the top CEOs in the world. The U.S. presidents are a great example. There is a lot of historical evidence of most of them getting less than 5 hours of sleep a night. Military, I brought it up, generals, admirals, same thing. So I think, especially in these populations that are pre-selecting for sleep deprivation, in a sense, right? It's like the harder you work, the more benefits you reap. Um, the people who make it to the top are also likely to be able to be resilient to sleep deprivation and or just not require so much sleep, and they're going to spend, like Elon Musk spending 20 hours a day working.
Yeah, so are these people that kind of know this about themselves? Like, will some of these people, if they have the option, still sleep a full 8 hours, or would they typically only get 2 to 4 hours of sleep and just be up?
I think they know it about themselves, but I think they don't know it's genetically regulated. Because I do know a few sleep hyper responders, and they just they're wide awake after 5 hours, and they can't do. They could try all the tips and tricks that I give the average, the mere mortals like us, and it doesn't work for them. They're up.
And does that have any implications for them, like from a hormonal standpoint or other health standpoint, or are
You
they
know,
good?
I would love if somebody did that study because here's the thing with everything that's out there in the world, there's genetic trade-offs. The best example I can give you is we recently published uh, a double-blind placebo-controlled study looking at these sleep genetics with caffeine. And we find that people who are naturally resilient to sleep deprivation because of their genetic makeup are actually super tolerant to caffeine. So they're hyper metabolizers of caffeine, and caffeine doesn't take them to the next level. But in people who are very sensitive to caffeine, so they're slow metabolizers, they have poor sleep resiliency. So caffeine under conditions of sleep deprivation can boost them up, but it doesn't do anything else for the people who are already sleep resilient. And this is looking at the same exact gene in this population. So it's just different. They're called single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're just like naturally occurring mutations in the genetic code that lead to genetic diversity. So I guarantee there's some, like, I don't want to say lethal or fatal genetic trade-off in these sleep hyper responders, but I guarantee as somebody did like an epidemiological study in these individuals, there's probably some heart condition or brain condition that's unique to this population. It's just, and if
Well,
there isn't, then wow, they're incredibly lucky.
well, it's just even too like being up 20 hours a day to do work or do whatever. It's just a lot more stress to deal with and think about versus like you look at the human next to them that's sleeping twice as much and like just in a relaxed state, not thinking.
Yeah,
The brain is regenerating and doing all kinds of other things. It, that definitely would be interesting to um, look at and see like a long term study on.
yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't envy them. I love sleep, so I'm glad I'm not one of those people. I feel like that would be torture for me to be up that long in a day.
I don't know. I wish I could get a little more bang for my buck with hours in the day, but we can't. So there was a couple other things we talked about too, and you know, another thing I think that people don't realize is what else sleep does. So, um, happiness, productivity,
Mhm.
moods. Does this affect other mental illnesses too? Like depression and anxiety is probably one that's can be a downward spiral with this of you have depression and or anxiety and then you can't sleep and that makes your anxiety worse and then you become an insomniac.
Yep. Yeah. So it's like told you, we've done these studies with sleep banking before. We've also done it with just full on sleep deprivation. Is the best way to put it is that sleep deprivation and lack of sleep hijacks the emotional system in every regard. So it hijacks it directly and then indirect too from, deactivating the frontal cortex or rational center of the brain. So when you have both systems simultaneously pushing the red emergency button, it's hard to recover from it unless you're getting adequate sleep again.
Are there certain functions of the brain that will like hyperstimulate or like certain traits that people will display when they have a lack of sleep?
Yeah, so this kind of relates back to how you said people will just, run the fumes and just be so sleep deprived and not know it. Is the reward system. Is sleep deprivation 100% triggers the award system. So it's almost like you get this emotional high off of being sleep deprived. And we know this because people who are sleep deprived make really poor decisions and are more likely to take risks. Like you have a lot of dopamine tone, dopamine being the neurochemical of pain and pleasure, pumping through their bodies because um, that's just what happens with sleep deprivation. And so it creates a vicious cycle where you're just constantly seeking this reward state. And if you're sleep deprived enough, it's going to uh, continue to fuel this reward state that never gets rebalanced or recalibrated.
So it's almost like just watch a toddler and it's just a little bit more magnified than it is in a maybe more conscious adult.
Yes, exactly. That's it. Basically, we turn into toddlers when we're sleep deprived, and that's
Yeah.
and I can tell you because I've worked in I've been doing sleep deprivation research for about 15 years, and I will tell you a lot of our research subjects turn into absolute just awful people when they're sleep deprived. I mean, we've had to kick a few people out of our studies because they just turn into dicks.
Well, I guess that can happen if you're doing it on purpose, though.
Yeah,
Then at least you know what's coming.
yeah.
Uh, and so, what about the 5 a.m. Worker outers and exercise goers? Is that a good thing that people are up that early doing that? Is it bad? You mentioned it on the other podcast there, and I wanted to shed some light there for people because I think people think, yeah, this is the best thing for me to get up at 5 a.m. and get after it, and then, depending on what the rest of your day and your family and home life looks like, and then just hormonally too, like, is it like, especially too from like a weight loss or weight maintenance versus weight gain perspective,
Hmm.
is this something people need to reconsider that maybe sleeping in will actually help them burn more fat than taking a 5 a.m. spin class?
Yep, absolutely. I told you being a morning or evening person or a short sleeper is genetically regulated. Um, about less than 10% of the population are true morning people based on genetics. The other 10% are true vampires based on genetics. I'm actually one of them. My parents are too, though. And I know that because I've taken my raw data from 23andMe and I've looked at the specific like night owl gene. So we're talking about 80% of the population. They typically aren't going to be at their best until 10 a.m. in the morning. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the 5 a.m. It's it speaks to somebody's motivation, but increased risk, in my opinion, increased risk for injury, increased risk for long-term hormonal issues, sickness. Um, yeah, I don't think anyone's ever done like a longitudinal or epidemiological study on like the 5 a.m. CrossFit class, but I would predict that they probably get sick more often and have to take more rest days throughout the periodization cycle than the people who are doing the evening classes or the noon classes. I know not all of us can do the noon class, but
What hormonal issues would you see there?
biggest thing would be cortisol. So cortisol is very low during sleep. If you have high levels of cortisol, it means that like you're just not going to have the deepest stages of sleep. You're probably going to stay in the later stages. So for people who are pre-activating their cortisol system, so advancing the release of it in the morning because they're working out, they're more prone to having hyper levels of cortisol throughout the day, which could lead to um, lighter instead of deeper sleep at night. It could also lead to overtraining, right? Because overtraining is a direct result of too much cortisol being released. To me, it's multifactorial. Immune system as well. Increased cortisol means decreased immune function.
That's really interesting. So you're basically saying too that like take the same allostatic workload across the board, but if you move it, you give it to someone at 5 a.m. versus, between 10 and 2 in the afternoon, you're going to get a different like overtraining effect or could.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Um, Again, I don't know if this has actually been studied, but theoretically, if the study was done, that would be my hypothesis, and I think my hypothesis would come true.
That's really interesting. And what about exercising before bed?
So, exercising before bed, we're kind of this is one study I wish I could do if I had money to do it, because obviously you're limited by research funds you have available. The problem with the existing literature is the rate of perceived exertion, if you look deep into the studies, never is past 60. So these people aren't getting it's like basically going on a moderate bike ride or a brisk walk. That's literally what they're doing. So you're talking RPE well less than 60%. Um, but I think if you did a study where you're looking at RPE that's 90 or greater than 90%, like most CrossFit metcons, then yeah, you're definitely going to see sleep disturbances. And the reason for that is sleep is all about not just cortisol availability or lack of availability. It's also about core body temperature. So the lower the core body temperature, the more likely you are to be in a restorative state of sleep. So if your core body temperature is high before you go to bed, that means you're going to stay in the lighter stages of sleep because your body temperature isn't just low enough yet for your body to get the deep restorative sleep. And so my recommendation for people who are doing high intensity training is to stop at least 3 hours before bedtime.
Oof. And now, just to counter that, because people would probably ask this or try this or say this would work instead, is what about taking a cold shower after your late night workout or using one of those? I've heard some good things about those like chili mats you could put in your bed, or like there's all these like
Yeah.
new refrigeration systems for under your bed. What about would those help counteract those effects at all, or no? Because
So
you're
funny
metabolically
enough,
doing it.
with cold showers, the immediate impact of taking a cold shower is your body's reaction to warm up.
Okay.
So you should actually they should be taking a hot shower because the immediate reaction is to cool down.
Okay.
Chili pads are different because one, it's not water and permeating your body, right? It's just topical and it's not like it's chilly, but it's not like taking a cold shower.
Okay.
So yes, that would be if you are doing like when I was competing in the CrossFit Games, sometimes we would actually we do it every year during the CrossFit Open, Friday Night Lights, right? Like I have a really hard time sleeping after Friday Night Lights. Um, and my recommendation would be to, take a really, really hot shower afterwards to cool your body down.
Okay. I'll keep that in mind after my 10 p.m. hockey games every Monday night.
Yeah, yeah. So I actually I consult with the Washington Capitals. So I was one of
Of
their
course
sleep.
you do.
Well, not as much anymore because I'm not in DC anymore. But when they won the Stanley Cup in 2018, I was part of the sleep consulting team, so I got to see the Stanley Cup and drink from it, and all of that. But
Yeah.
Yeah, hockey players are the worst. They have the worst sleep habits and schedules, and it's not just pros. It's as young as high school, because by the time you guys get rink time, it's already 9 at night.
Yeah, it's 5 a.m. or 9 at night. There's
Yep,
like
exactly.
no one can play hockey in the normal hours of the day, apparently.
Nope. No. Well, it kind of goes with the culture too. You gotta increase the grit factor.
Yep. And so other things that could hinder a workout. So what about eating before bed? That's one, like I said, and something I experience, and maybe it's just a learned behavior I have. Maybe it's that I did for a while. I was kind of like chronically under eating, really without knowing it, or just I don't have time during the day to eat, so I'm hungry at night. So something there, like there, you'll probably get mad at me for this, but there's plenty of times like I'll eat around 7:30 or so. I might have a little snack after that, but like sometimes I can't fall asleep. I will go downstairs, have like 2 scoops of peanut butter, and like be out like a light.
So peanut butter's not bad, because the culprit is high sugar foods. So
Okay.
high sugar foods, anything with a high glycemic index, spikes your blood glucose levels. Peanut butter is not bad. Same with like casein protein. So you talk about like waking up in the middle of the night with hunger. Totally get it. That's actually one thing. Being a competitive CrossFitter, I don't miss when we were training, competing in games. Like I hated that, the middle of the night insomnia, but I found that casein protein can help minimize that.
Yeah,
And
like I won't even. It's not that I'll wake up. Like once I'm asleep. But like that nighttime hunger, like I can't fall asleep if I'm hungry type deal.
oh yeah, no, it's awful. I don't miss. I think the two things I don't miss about, people are like, "Oh, you're going to compete as a masters athletes in the games." I'm like, "No, I'm done. My body, like, I don't miss the midnight hunger, and I don't miss being tired all the time."
Yeah. Oh, we forgot to put that in the intro too. Is that she's been a CrossFit Games athlete as well. Uh, so, so with that being said, so is it bad? Because I think you mentioned like you shouldn't eat to optimize sleep like more than 3 hours before bed.
Yeah, so that's part of it, is like you want to get your blood glucose levels to like a really low level, because that's part of it. Like sleep's supposed to be this restorative state, and your body and your brain doesn't want to worry about digesting food or doing some other biological process. It literally just wants to sleep. Um, and so that's part of it. And if you think about it, like intermittent fasting, sleeping 8 to 9 hours is intermittent fasting, because if you're stopping eating 3 hours before bed and then you sleep 8 hours, that means you haven't eaten in 11 hours.
Mm-hmm.
So it is okay actually to eat breakfast in the morning instead of waiting until noon for your first meal.
Sounds about right. And so that being said, so is it better to like get the macronutrients you need and like fulfill your caloric requirement if it's within say an hour before bed, even like if you need 700 calories to fulfill that, or should I choose to forego that and just try to get better sleep?
Um, I think it depends on who you are. So, and what I mean by that, are you an athlete or are you a recreational fitness person? Athletes always should eat. Recreational fitness, maintain, lean muscle mass, lower body fat, forego eating. Um, But I think with athletes, like they push their bodies to such a large extent that even if they have higher blood glucose before they go to bed, they're still going to sleep because they've just pushed their body to the limit, and their brain will find a way to sleep independent of the circumstances.
Now, will we see differences too in someone that, or sleep differences in someone that might be in a caloric deficit versus someone that's not in a deficit?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, it comes back to just being in a heightened sympathetic state, right? Anything that's stressful is going to increase your sympathetic activity and increase cortisol. People who are in a caloric deficit, that's stressful for the body, right? It's a threat to our basic survival mechanisms to eat. And so that's going to disrupt your sleep versus being, on an isocaloric or like even eating a little bit more calories than normal.
Hmm.
I think that's better than being in a caloric deficit.
Okay. Another question for you here. If you have to choose between sleep and working out, which one are you going to choose?
Oh God damn it, that's a hard one for me. Um, my now, Allison, now I would say sleep for sure. Um, you
Not
know,
just for Allison though, for like the general, let's say 31-year-old washed up wannabe weightlifter, hockey player that has a busy job too.
okay, no, I would definitely say sleep because the only way for like doing all those stressful things in the day is to actually sleep. And if you think about, again, I talked about the benefits of sleep. It's program intermittent fasting, right? So that's one way to maintain fitness. It's also giving you all the other benefits from the clearance of waste to building muscle instead of breaking it down. So yes, I would go with sleep.
So yeah, so what do you have to say about that too? With like the whole like people think, and the old me used to think this way too, and I don't anymore. Just as I've gotten older and wiser and learned that I don't have to live in the gym to get leaner, stronger, better, whatever. So people think though, like, oh, I'm not gonna lose weight or I'm not gonna be as healthy if I don't get to the gym, and like people will have a long day at work, a big deadline, and then they try to squeeze this workout in at 9, 10 o'clock at night, and then they end up in the cycle of they're sleep deprived or whatever. Like, what's the outcome of that look like versus like take the night, get a good night's sleep, wake up tomorrow and try tomorrow?
Yeah, so that's really what it is, and that's like the mindset we're trying to change is that extra 20 minutes. There's about 2 hours of harm, at least, associated with that extra 20 minutes of exercise. You're better off just doing some mobility and yoga, um, like super light yoga than trying to get in a workout.
Mm. And so that's something too of like, could people potentially gain weight from exercising by having poor sleep habits, just like too much stress?
Yeah, I actually think, honestly, I haven't studied this, but I think that's the issue. Just I've been doing CrossFit now 12 years. I've been a part of the community ever since. I think that's the issue with the 5 a.m. class and like the people who are the early morning workout people. For those who come in to CrossFit saying they want to lose weight or like um, lose body fat. I don't want to say lose weight, lose body
It's
fat.
body fat. Yeah.
But that's actually what's holding them back is because they're probably not getting enough sleep just so they can make the 5 a.m. class.
Hmm. Interesting. And then what about caffeine?
Oh yeah, so I mean caffeine for
Let's
people who
say,
are in the 5 a.m. class are that's definitely to their benefit. There's this great study they looked at trained Olympic lifters, and they found that caffeine is very effective for improving performance at night. But during the early morning, all it does is it gets people to like a decent level. But there's not as much of a performance enhancement effect in the morning as there is at night if you're lifting. Um, but the big thing I would say about caffeine is no more than 2 cups of coffee, which is like 200 milligrams, every 3 to 4 hours. And make sure you stop drinking coffee at least 10 hours before bed because the half life of caffeine is actually 16 hours, or sorry, is 8 hours, which means that the caffeine is technically in your system for about 16 hours.
let's go back for a second to that weightlifting thing. So, uh, caffeine improves performance at night.
Hmm.
So, do you know like what times they were training at?
Yeah, it was like late evening, so around 6 or 7.
Okay. And then what does their sleep schedule look like? Do we know that?
No, we don't know that, but usually, again, these are trained Olympic lifters, so the half life of caffeine is probably much greater for them because they're metabolism is much higher than the average
Hmm.
person. Um, we don't know that, but again, this is like a single time point study.
Yeah, because I mean, so you probably know it too. Like Caffeine and Kilos is a big weightlifting brand out there that basically is promoting heavy coffee use with heavy weightlifting.
Yeah.
Uh, but I've been trying to. So like, I actually can't tolerate caffeine for whatever reason. It just irritates my gut, and so I was a big coffee drinker before, and so I used to be like, just like or classic conditioning, like Pavlov's dogs, like, oh, the chemical little pre workout at 5 o'clock
Mhm.
is now it's time to work out. And it's been hard to kind of break that pattern, but it's like, would everyone do better if we weren't taking that caffeine at 5 o'clock at night for that extra little, uh, spurt of energy versus just getting the optimal night's sleep, foregoing the pre workout, and just living in this world without that need for stimulants to improve afternoon performance?
No, absolutely. So I'm not a big fan of pre-workout because it's usually over the caffeine limit. So anything above 200 milligrams, your brain's not actually receiving. But the other thing too is use case basis, right? Use it in a competition. I only use pre-workout when I'm competing, and I only use it for the weightlifting events of a CrossFit competition. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm all about like preserving that tolerance for caffeine.
That was actually something interesting you talked about on the other one too. With the caffeine was so like you said, like some of these things have 250 to 450 milligrams of caffeine, which is like, I don't
It's
know, four or five cups of coffee in a little concentrated dose. So my question about that was, how does that work with the body? Because I know there is that. So caffeine is a stimulant and a diuretic at a
mhm.
certain level, but if you have that baseline tolerance where you're drinking, say, a cup a day, it doesn't any longer have that diuretic effect unless you up your dose again.
Yep.
But what is happening to that caffeine? So if someone's taking a concentrated dose of 400 milligrams of caffeine and the max effectiveness is 200, where's that other 250 going, or
They're
200 going?
well, it's they're just pissing it out basically.
Okay,
It's
so they're not. It's not being utilized, or
being
it's.
utilized by the brain, I should say. It would be, like processed, metabolized through the liver and stuff. But in terms of having a performance enhancing, I guess looking at it from the level of performance enhancement, they're not going to do any better.
Okay,
Um,
so
but
and it's not.
oh, go ahead.
It's not making that time of utilization longer. Or anything like none of it's waiting in line to cross the blood-brain barrier or anything like that.
No,
Okay, interesting. Okay, so all those pre-workouts are just all you guys out there are just wasting money on them.
yeah. I mean, well, pre-workouts though, they have other stuff in it and again, that's why I know why people use them in combination with uh, lifting, right? Because it's the overall feel good effect. And I use them too, but only during competition because that's when it matters.
Are there other similar like stimulants or um, supplements that people can use for maybe a shorter that don't have such a long half life compared to caffeine that they could use at night to work out to give them that boost of energy that wouldn't interfere with sleep?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say anything that is they're all going to be stimulants and they're all have the potential to interfere with sleep. But I think ones that have less caffeine would be like green tea. So green tea
Hmm.
has about 50 milligrams.
Hmm.
Um, and that's in a lot of, I'll use FitAid, RX Aid. There's some green tea in that. I know some of the other ones like Killcliff has some green tea. I think theirs is green tea. Don't quote me. But yeah, it's just taking a smaller dose, just knowing that it might interfere with your sleep. It's never going to be a perfect formula. You have to figure out what works for you, but
Yeah, for
it
sure.
certainly can help reduce the risk of disrupting sleep.
Yes. And then I think the last thing I had, well, there was two other things actually here too. So you want to talk a little bit about how cryotherapy and dry needling, which is something I am a practitioner of. can help with sleep. So do you want to talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, so a few years ago, we did a small case study, longitudinal, on elite CrossFit athletes who were using cryotherapy. Controlling for the days they used it, and then they did self-report sleep and quality of sleep using this clinical inventory. And we actually found that cryotherapy improved their sleep and their sleep quality. I imagine it's the same with dry needling too. I mean, you've said patient experiences. I'll tell you personal experiences of being dry needled a lot, right? Is I had the best night of sleep ever the night after getting dry needled. And it makes sense because you're starting to teeter the system into a more parasympathetic state. And that's what cryotherapy is doing too, is like after the initial 3 minute period where your body thinks it's going to die, it goes into this ultimate state of relaxation to compensate. And, I truly believe both put you in a parasympathetic state, which could improve sleep.
Now, would the cryotherapy have to be done earlier in the day? Like you said, like don't take a cold shower before bed because that actually heats your body up. Is that the same with the cryo?
Yeah. So one of the things about, again, this is this case study, but most of these athletes were like, getting that done in the middle of the afternoon.
And does that give them just like one night of good sleep, or is it like once a week of cryo will give them, a week's good night's sleep?
So, good question. It was the night after cryotherapy. So, on days they did cryotherapy, they had increased sleep and better sleep quality that night, but it wasn't true for the day. And that's why, it's like a longitudinal case study.
And so are we just talking about like the place you go and pay to get in like the cryotherapy chamber versus like what would like an ice bath look like? Would that give you similar results or no?
No, so ice baths are different because what makes cryo unique is the water doesn't permeate, the coldness doesn't permeate your skin, right? It's just pulling blood to your muscles of the area that's impacted by the cold. It's not pulling blood to your heart like cold water baths are. Um, and so because of that, it's a different physiological mechanism and response.
Hmm, interesting. And so you said there are studies on dry needling, or are you just something you were
No,
curious
I'm
about?
just, yeah, I don't know if there
Yeah.
are. I imagine.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything come out, and that's one of those things about the physical therapy field is there's always a lot of arguments between because PT was developed basically in I think it was basically five different continents at once. So everyone has these different outlooks on what works and how this should work versus what's happening. So there's all this curiosity with the science of it and a lot of arguing about it. But for a while, they said there was no evidence that dry needling was any bit effective at all. And now, 10 years later, it's like, oh, yeah, sorry, we actually lied. Like it does work. And here's what it does from an orthopedic standpoint. Now, yes, dry needling does definitely have like a hormonal effect or some type of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous response of people will, you could stick one needle in their upper trap and all of a sudden like their whole
Yeah.
body is sweating profusely. Some people get a needle jabbed in them and they pass right out.
Yeah.
I've only had that happen once, but there's all kinds of different things that it seems like dry needling could do to improve that. I'll have patients come home or tell me they went home after a needling session, like they unexpectedly passed out for 3 hours on the couch, or they were hyper alert and super aware, and like they felt like they had had like a high dose of caffeine after it. So you'll get these weird like different effects from it depending on the person too.
No,
And
and I think that's the thing is like I think in some places it's still experimental treatment, but it's because I know not all states like endorse it equally, but I don't know. I've
yeah,
seen more positive than negative. I'm a big fan of it.
yeah. There's it's a lot of just red tape and political stuff
Yeah.
in the field that the industry is driven by. So it's becoming more and more popular. So I don't see dry needling going anywhere. The only thing is like the acupuncture society doesn't want us dry needling
Oh
because
yeah, of course. I know
it's
that's one of the lobbying
right.
groups, right?
Yeah, so they're lobbying against us to do it, but I don't see a reason why we can't do it. But
Well, I'm a
uh,
big fan too. It was like a lot of it was first done in the army. Like the army PTs were some of the first in the country or world to like do it.
yeah, of course. I mean, and acupuncture has been around for thousands of years, and people still swear by it. Granted, we have a different approach, but there's still something to getting punctured with a needle and it causing some type of effect. And I've had people cry with like emotional responses before and things, so it can
Yeah,
get really weird.
I
But
love it.
yeah, the last thing I want to talk to you about was sleep apnea. So
Mhm.
I think I heard somewhere before there's like over 88 different like sleep disorder diagnoses. Um,
Yep.
Probably one of the most commonly and maybe un or mistreated diagnoses would be sleep apnea.
Hmm.
So, as we mentioned before, this was I've been dealing with chronic sinus issues and sinusitis, and I'm looking to have a CT scan to maybe get like my turbinates reduced and my septum undeviated. But uh, what do you have to say about like sleep apnea and what people experience? What should they think about doing? Would a fitness tracker, if someone suspects they might have sleep apnea, would a fitness tracker tell them they would have some type of condition or?
Yeah. So the fitness tracker, again, it's within trends only, right? Data should only make you curious. I was on the board for this device that was going in the process of being FDA approved before the company went under. That was supposed to look at a at home diagnostic for sleep apnea. It basically was you put it here on your forehead, and it looks at sleeping positions, and it also had a blood oximeter, which obviously the blood oxygen content in your forehead is not going to be as high as from your index finger. But that's probably the only wearable that could have potentially at home diagnosed sleep apnea. So I say all this because I'm not really a big fan of wearables trying to determine this unless they go through a formalized process with the FDA, and then maybe I'll believe it. But apnea comes in all shapes and forms. If you're an athlete, a high level athlete, and or in the military, 90% of the time you're probably going to have sleep apnea. I mean, I myself have mild sleep apnea. Um, a lot of it, if you have mild sleep apnea, it's better to fix your sleeping position. It's better to wear nasal strips. It's better to do something than to go on CPAP because CPAP will just detrain your diaphragm to breathe. Um, if you have moderate to severe sleep apnea, yes, 100% you have to be on CPAP. There's no question. Like, it's just, it's such a compromise in your quality of life because there's very disparate number of times you're awake between mild sleep apnea and severe. For mild sleep apnea, you're waking up 6 times a night. With severe obstructive sleep apnea, you're literally waking up 30 to 40 times an hour. Same with mild sleep apnea. You're waking up 6 to 8 times an hour, not 30 to 45 times an hour.
Mhm. And what percent of the population has like mild sleep apnea? Do you think?
Oh, that's a tough one. I can only answer for the military. So we know
Okay.
that active duty military, greater than 80% have sleep apnea.
Okay. And so you said it can detrain the diaphragm?
Yeah, because it's continuous air. Like, think of it like
Mhm.
the ventilator, right?
Yeah.
It's not the same, but it's continuous air. So
So
you don't
have
start to
they
breathe
done any studies on that of like the effects of that?
for long term.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking of like for physical therapy patients too of uh, a lot of low back pain and even thoracic stiffness and everything comes from faulty breathing mechanics and people not knowing how to breathe. So if I have patients and we have a breathing questionnaire too, but I never considered that because you still need to use your diaphragm through the day to breathe. But I guess if you're not using it half the time or a third of the time, what is that implication for from a physical movement perspective?
Yeah, so that I don't know, but I agree with you. I think I have like one of those I have it right here. One of those. diaphragmatic breathers. I bought this like right before COVID. Um, and like, I'm sure if people are doing things, whether it's yoga or lifting, fitness, using this to better train their diaphragm, I'm sure there's a correlation between having fewer sleep issues at night. But again, it's in its infancy.
What is that thing?
It's a diaphragmatic breather trainer. So like basically you like breathe in and out, and it has different tension points,
Okay.
and makes it like really difficult if you put it at the highest tension point to breathe in. So yeah, there's all these like, it's supposed to also train you for like better withstanding high lactic acid threshold workouts. But I bought
Okay.
it early on during COVID when, just to like try
Something
not
to
to
do.
throw up. Yeah. No,
And
I
it
actually
almost.
I was deployed during COVID during to New York City, so I helped set up the field support hospital at the
Oh.
Javits Center. So
Okay.
I bought one of these right before I got the call, or right after I got the call to deploy, because I figured I was gonna, at the time just get COVID and die from it. So I thought
Jeez.
maybe if I worked on my diaphragm a little more, it would reduce the possibility of me dying from it.
Wow. Yeah.
To end on a dark note.
And for those of you watching, to end on a light note, it kind of looks like something you would smoke marijuana out
Oh
of.
yeah, I know. No, only we gotta wait 14 more years for that. So
Yeah.
no, I retire in 14 years, so then I can.
Yeah. And what about those? So like something I actually just started to try, and I don't know if this is gonna end well for me or not, or just me just discontinuing use. But the MAD devices, or the mandibular adjustment device.
Yeah, those are helpful. So if people who have more structural issues, like it sounds like yours is more structural, they definitely help.
Yeah, because I actually noticed. So I got like an audible thing that can listen to my snoring through the night. And I
Hmm.
actually fell asleep last night without it in because it was kind of uncomfortable. And then my girlfriend was pushing me in my sleep because I was snoring so bad. And then throughout, I put it in around 1 a.m. and woke up with it in, and there was no sounds recorded for that time period after that.
Huh.
So it might do something, and just having it in, like I feel like even trying to make myself snore, it doesn't actually work.
Yeah.
However, the device I got is quite uncomfortable. So, are there any certain ones, like over the counter ones, you have to recommend?
No, I don't. That's really not my area. Most of them who I think the best ones are if you get it from a dentist.
Yeah,
Like you have to go through insurance stuff with that, but
yeah, yeah. We don't like insurance around here all that much. We use it, but
yeah, I
yeah, I
mean,
was
that's
just
right off when you ask me these questions, just because I come more from the
yeah.
clinical side. So,
Yeah. Yeah, no, just something that I was looking up, and people were like, yeah, you don't need to use a CPAP, and CPAP can have some implications. And this would be something for people to try first. And I've never really heard anyone talk about it until I did my own research on it, where it seemed like this might be something that's more cost effective, less harmful, unless you already have like JMD that
hmm.
could help. Because yeah, I could even feel just like it pulls your jaw forward a little bit and takes pressure off of your airway so that air can go in. Even if you are a nasal breather at night,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter because you have physical mass impeding on your trachea there. So it's definitely an interesting thing I'm trying, and I want to do more experimentation with in versus out. And if this device continues to record, maybe it had a fault last night. I don't know. It was the second night I tried wearing it, and first night I recorded it. So it'll be interesting
Well,
to see.
I mean, I would say just keep doing it if it's helping your sleep.
Yeah, that's the plan. And so, is there anything else you would like to add here?
Um, I guess if you want some summarized information, you could buy my book, Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain. So chapter 5 really goes into a lot of what we talked about today. Um, Otherwise, just I mean, we pretty much covered the full gamut here.
Yeah, I asked a lot of random questions out of nowhere. So
No, they're good. It's
yeah,
it's just multidimensional. So,
yeah. So and Allison, where can people find you?
so best place to reach me is through Instagram. It's Doc Jock ZZZ DOC JOCK ZZZ. There's also a link to my book there. You can buy it on Amazon. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Nice. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This was very informative.
Of course.
You're probably the most well decorated podcast guest we've had on, with lots of different things that there's probably even more that you haven't mentioned that are on your resume somewhere. So,
Yeah, I'm
uh,
just ADD, you know.
it was exciting to have you on. It was a good conversation. So, thanks for coming on. And I will include in this episode show notes the other episode you did on the top 10 things to improve sleep quality and optimization. And I will include the links to your book and some of your other reference materials there. So, everyone else, thanks for listening, and hope to have you listen next time.